everybody, I'm Esther Emery, and you found my personal channel today. So feel free to get yourself a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, or start in on some dishes or some laundry, because I'm just going to sit right here and tell a story. Today's story is one that I feel like I owe you, because there's actually a quite popular video on my other channel, the Fautomatic Off-Grid channel, about being the daughter of my mother, which of course is a story I can tell every day and will often tell on this channel. And it was called Testimony of a Famous Homesteader's Kid, I think. If you haven't seen it, go see it, or maybe even if you want a refresher, go and see it. It's a really powerful story. The gist of which is that my mother was into homesteading, and I was terribly embarrassed by that. And then I changed my mind. Funny how that happens. Funny how kids come home. I always had my mother's nose. Turns out I've got a lot of her opinions and her passions as well. But I skipped a part of that story. As I was telling you about the relationship struggles between a daughter and a mother, I skipped part of the history of America, part of the cultural trends, and specifically my mother's comeback. So, for anybody who needs to catch up here, my mother is Carla Emery. She wrote a book called The Encyclopedia of Country Living. When it first came out, it was called The Old-Fashioned Recipe Book, and when it first came out, it didn't really come out at all. She sold quite a number of copies before it was written, which was exactly the sort of thing my mother would do. Very impulsive, very passionate, very faith-driven woman. She believed that if she was called to do it, it was going to be possible. And it always was, but her children didn't always believe it, or at least this particular one of her children didn't always believe it. In the 70s, she reached a peak of popularity. The mid-70s, she took her book to a craft fair in maybe it was 1974, and she got herself on TV, and her table was mobbed. Then she ended up doing some television. She was funny on TV. Partly on purpose and partly not on purpose, because she was a country girl, a legit, real-deal country girl. So she had some TV appearances. And as a teenager especially, those are the ways that I defined success. So when she was a single mother in the 90s and I was coming of age, I didn't see any marks of success on her. I thought she was a has-been. I actually used that word to describe her to one of my brothers, who was a bit horrified, I think. I thought, she's dead as a doornail and she just doesn't know it yet. And I thought it was a bit audacious of her to not accept defeat, in the sense that it seemed to me that America had just moved on. America had moved on to other things. We were no longer milking goats or beheading chickens. And I guess in the 90s I was right. Certainly in the 90s I had my reasons to believe that. But even as I was coming of age, I turned 21 in the year 2000, my mother's people were finding her again. And the first moment for that was Y2K, when she assembled a following among what we now call preppers. For a while they were Y2K preppers. But people who were concerned about cataclysmic events, or concerned about preparing. And she assembled a bit of a following among the Y2K crowd in 1999 and the year 2000. And that was the first time in my kind of cognizant life, since my childhood, that I had seen people listen to my mother and recognize the validity of her position as something other than a bit of a loon, or kind of an extra outside position. So the year 2000, I guess you could say, was the beginning of it. And at that point I was 21 and well out of my mother's house and on and doing my own thing. Well, Y2K didn't turn out to be too big of a deal. There are those out there who still believe that the preparation was necessary, but there are many who think that it was all a big scare. So 2000 came and went, and I thought my mother's star would fall again. I thought her renewed admiration, this group of preppers she had assembled, was probably another fluke. But I was completely wrong about that. She died in 2005, but between the year 2000 and the year 2005, her popularity increased steadily. People knew her name. I'd see her book once I was into Facebook, and I would see her name on Facebook. I would see people talking about her lifestyle, talking about her values, talking about something more than just what they needed to be prepared for the disaster, although that was certainly still a part of that identity. I saw people being drawn to my mother's message. Sometimes I wonder how different things might have been if my mother had given up. Sometimes I wonder if she ever had the impulse to give up. If she did, I didn't see it, and perhaps that's the lack of empathy common in teenagers, and perhaps it was that she was very guarded and very protected and very strong. But I do wonder if she felt, I should give up. This isn't worth it. Everybody thinks it's stupid. I wonder if she had those thoughts, and if so, how she found the inner strength to hold on. Because my mother's people were waiting for her. My mother's people were there for her. In her last 5 years of life, she took what she called tours, sweeping back and forth across the country. She'd do the southern United States during the winter, and the northern United States during the summer. And she would go to very small gatherings, usually. A book signing, a church, a club, a gathering at someone's home. And as long as people fed her and put her up, she would speak. She gave a talk on the modern homesteading movement. She gave a talk on peak oil. She gave talks on issues that are now in the news. Something that continues to touch me about my mother's story, and that I hope will also touch you, is that she didn't let the culture decide for her what was and wasn't of value. And she didn't let the culture decide that she was or wasn't of value. She kept doing her work. And she did so with the audacity of someone who disregards whether it's possible or not. My mother was often one to take on things that seemed impossible. And that wasn't always easy to be her child when she was taking on a very difficult or impossible task. She has a text in her book, which really hurt my feelings when I was a teenager, where she writes about how all the animals and all the plants are all her children. And I thought, how does she take on the whole world as her children when she's got 7 of them? And we're less her calling than her work is. But I've come to realize that that's just what it looks like for a woman who's called to leadership. And that's what it looks like for a woman who is called to do hard things. Her children are called too. Just like when someone is called to be a pastor, their whole family is called to that. Their whole family is called to the ministry. And that's maybe not something that as a child I would have chosen, but it has a lot of value to me now. I think my favorite part of it is that I also was not swayed by the people. I didn't come around to my mother's message because I saw, oh wow, she's getting 100,000 copies of her book have sold. That it wasn't my reasoning at all, because I also had come around to a place where I wasn't letting the culture define what is and isn't important, and I wasn't letting the culture define whether or not I am important. I came around to my mother's message because I felt the calling inside, and I felt that it was my truth inside, and also because I had married someone who had a passion for many of the same things. These days when I struggle, I think of my mother, and I know that she did wonder whether she should quit. She did wonder if she was doing the right thing, standing behind a message that was countercultural to many and unacceptable to some. I think about how she thought about it, how she weighed the choices, and how in the end there really wasn't any choice. She was who she was, and she just kept putting one foot in front of the other. She was who she was, and she just kept going. And she had her comeback. Her people were there waiting for her They were waiting for her in their farmhouse kitchens and their little apartments with plants on the balcony. They were waiting for her message because they recognized that it was a message of rejuvenation and a message of healing and a message of truth. They recognized her, and they recognized her value. So if you have these days, and maybe you don't, but if you have these days where you think, what am I doing? I hope that you'll remember my mother's perseverance. Hope you'll remember how she just was who she was and put one foot in front of the other. And she became someone who was meaningful and beloved to thousands. Not because that was her goal, but because that was her authentic path. I'm Esther Emery. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I'll see you next week.